The title of this panel is Agriculture and Religion in Global Context. My name is Jeremy Wiebe, and I'm an associate of the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies at the University of Winnipeg, which is where I'm coming to you from today. The University of Winnipeg is located on ancestral lands, on Treaty 1 territory, lands that are also the heartland of the Métis people. Before we begin, a few words of instruction about the format of this panel for those joining us now for the first time. Presentations will proceed in the order given in the conference program available online, and I will provide a brief introduction to each speaker before they present. After all three papers have been delivered, we will have a question period. This is your opportunity to interact with the panelists and their presentations. Please submit your questions by clicking the Q&A button on your screen, or if you prefer to pose your question orally, let me know by chat and I can unmute you. Feel free to submit questions at any time during the presentations. I look forward to our discussion. With that, let us begin. Ben Nobbs-Thiessen is the chair in Mennonite Studies and an assistant professor of history at the University of Winnipeg. He also serves as editor of the Journal of Mennonite Studies, in which selected papers from this conference will appear, and is a co-director of the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies. His research explores the movements of Mennonites and other migrant communities across the frontiers of the Americas and has involved archival research and oral history in Bolivia, Paraguay, Mexico, Canada, and the United States. He will be presenting today on the Bolivia Mystique, MCC between the state, peasants, and international development, 1960 to 1985. Ben.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction, Jeremy. So I have some slides I'll pop up now, but yeah, I'm excited to be here and discuss with my other panelists. There seems to be a lot of productive overlap between questions about developmental missions, which are in some ways secular and in some ways religious, that involve MCC work in different contexts. And yeah, without further ado, I'll pop up my screen. So the region that I've done most of my research on, one of the largest centers of MCC operations by the 1980s, I believe the largest, is Bolivia. And in particular, if we look at the location map here, the Eastern Lowland Department of Santa Cruz, the largest territorial division within Bolivia, and the site after 1952, especially of a massive internal, and it's mixed here, colonization and development and road building, modernization project writ large. And MCC found themselves over the following decades in the middle of these operations. And I think what's kind of fascinating about the MCC Bolivia story, especially thinking about what we've talked about already in this conference, is seeing it as a bit of a pivot point from MCC operations that are defined in sort of ethno-religious terms, assisting fellow brethren, you know, as the Russian case is driven forward in our panels yesterday, to something very different. MCC work based on assisting non-Mennonite populations in the context of rural development, community development strategies, and that involved sometimes health, education, farming, as is the subject of this panel. And we can kind of see that pivot point if we look at the sort of first, encounter really with MCC in Bolivia, as it was narrated by J. Winfield Fretz, a well-known Mennonite sociologist who traveled to Bolivia in 1960 with South America director Frank Wiens, and was in the country really to visit a very small group of struggling Paraguayan Mennonites that had settled there in the previous decade, and traveled out to their colonies and, created the roots of an assistance program to support these Mennonites, specifically helping establish a clinic going forward run by and staffed by MCC. But even as he was doing that, and kind of resembling the work in Paraguay that especially John talked about, Fretz also noted that Frank Wiens is working with the Point 4 program in Bolivia. So this is the rubric for US development assistance around the world under Eisenhower. And it's quite remarkable. In the 1950s, Bolivia is the largest not per capita, actually in absolute terms in Latin America in the 50s, Bolivia is the largest recipient of US aid. Targeted a lot of these development programs. Means it actually been kind of loaned out to Point 4, which had also worked with MCC in Bolivia or in Paraguay previously. And so there was this immediate sort of division between MCC role in the country. Was it going to, again, support fellow brethren, Low German Mennonites in particular, or was it going to get kind of sucked into the nexus of US and national developmentalist politics? And what I want to kind of add to the equation here, right, is, and again, these are just some maps to situate here. On the left, Bolivia, on the right, this expanding sphere of MCC operations over the decades. But what I want to situate you with is, I think as John Weir pointed out and others in our early panels, we see Mennonites working alongside other faith-based organizations, missions in Bolivia at the time. Indeed, a huge sort of surge of missions entered the country in the wake of the 1952 revolution. So the Methodist Church, which had been working there for some time, expanded its operations. It was really proclaiming in the 1950s that Bolivia was a land of decision or a land of opportunity, and especially looking at colonization projects. Maryknoll nuns were quite active in education throughout the region as well. So MCC joined these other mission organizations and faith-based organizations, Catholic Relief, in providing services at the request of the Bolivian government to these colonists in lowland zones. And the question then there is, how did these religious organizations, on the one hand, understand their secular and the religious aspects to their work, and on the other hand, how did they become involved in the politics of the nation as it shifted over the years from a revolutionary, social-minded, socialist is sort of a debated term for the MNR, which controlled Bolivia in the 50s and 60s, but a social revolution into an authoritarian regime by the late 60s and early 1970s, right? So in writing in other contexts, talking about the Maryknolls in Guatemala, for instance, Susan Fitzpatrick Behrens writes, nuns' work and the contradictions inherent in their roles inevitably led to politicization. So this is something we could consider in the Bolivian case. We also kind of have a sense of the arrival of religious actors in the region. Leslie Gill, an anthropologist, talks about this as the invasion of the sects in terms of Protestant groups, especially Pentecostal groups, church building in the wake of the revolution, right? The door is kind of opened. The Catholic Church is not restricted really, as sometimes happens in post-revolutionary moments in Latin America, but certainly Protestant groups are welcomed in. So what does MCC do in this context? Some of its earliest work, in which conscientious objectors are traveling down as volunteers, as paxmen, they end up being essentially farmed out to other religious organizations. So the Methodists have a longer established institution in lowland Bolivia. And to give an example, when Ken Graber comes to work in Bolivia in the early 60s, he arrives in La Paz, has no idea where he's going. People tell him to head over to the American Institute, the school the Methodists have run for most of the century. And then they direct him down to Santa Cruz, to the lowlands, to the Methodist Rural Institute, which you can see here just north of the city of Santa Cruz, in the northern sort of farming gateway town of Montero. And Graber and others that come as volunteers over the years end up working with the Methodist Church, or sort of seconded out to the mission there, working in rural development. Indeed, he's met, in his first morning in Santa Cruz by Methodist missionaries Bob and Rosa Caulfield, to make him breakfast and kind of show him around and introduce him to the other Mennonite workers that are already in the region. If we think about the development map of Santa Cruz, I already gave you a sense there's a lot of religious actors working in this region in colonization. We also have international development organizations active as well. The US government is also there by the 1960s through the Peace Corps and other colonization programs that are supported by the Alliance for Progress. The British have a tropical sort of mission that is supporting agriculture in the region. Universities like Madison, Wisconsin are sending folks in to do investigations as well in their Land Tenure Institute. And another scholar, Molly Geidel, talks about this as kind of a saturation of a sort of dubious expertise. There's so many projects going on and they're not really being coordinated. So she points to the example of the Peace Corps down in Charagua to the south of Santa Cruz, distributing powdered milk in a region where the UN is actually trying to establish a sort of dairy, a thriving dairy, right? And there's sort of countless examples of this stumbling over one another in the search for sort of a little developmental niche. What's also happening at the same time is the nature of MCC's little clinic, the Tres Palmas Clinic. I think I've got a image of it here. We can see is transforming too. This still did follow that old style of outreach to Low German Mennonite brethren, but pretty soon, about 80%, as you can see from this archival material, of the patients at the clinic are Bolivians, and only about 20% are Mennonites from the small surrounding colonies. And this is an opportunity for those that are working there as nurses, also going out in the ambulance that MCC provides to visit surrounding communities. And we have reflections like those from Mary Williams and Helen Jansen, who you can see at the door here, I believe, describing their work, right? They remember a mix of sort of religious and secular health-based initiatives, devotions in surrounding community, distributing religious films or screening them, agricultural films, health caravans to inspect patients. You know, and on a single Sunday afternoon, they say 95 people are visited, you know, in this mobile aspect of the clinic. They serve thousands of Bolivians, mostly transplanted from the highlands as settlers, as well as those living in lowland communities over the years. And the service is small. I mean, we could question how significant this is, but it's worth pairing with archival documents that indicate how Bolivians in the region are experiencing national healthcare provision and other support from the state. And this is where the clinic's located. I believe it's to the southwest side of the Cotoca colony. This is the first national colony set up by the UN and in cooperation with the Bolivian government, and one of the Mennonite colonies from Paraguay. Canadians, they is off to the side there as well. And the colonists from Cotoca, the national colonists, primarily indigenous people, Aymara Quechua speakers, petitioned the government in the 1960s, the very period when more and more people are going to the Bolivian clinic. And they describe the conditions in the Cotoca colony, which is supposed to be provisioned with all sorts of services, agricultural, public health, education. They say, quote, medical service was non-existent. The beds had been removed from the health center. The base's chief agronomist does things unrelated to agronomy. And they characterize the head accountant, Eduardo Cajias, as a degenerate drunk who committed abuses against the colonizers, demonstrates immorality, and refuses to work, saying, I will not attend to these Indians. So state-based provision often reflected the racial polarization of Bolivian society, a country with an indigenous majority who is being moved in some cases to these colonization zones, and a mestizo or European identifying middle class and upper elite. So the MCC certainly found a role in kind of moving into regions where the state was either absent or was not performing its duties according to settlers. But, you know, there was a steady supply of volunteers coming in. And I think by the later part of the 1960s, MCC was interested in expanding its development activities. You know, and there was a tension there. Visiting missionaries would tour MCC operations. One remarked the following: the longer I'm here in Bolivia on this trip, the more I wonder how it is possible for MCC to be active here for 10 years and give only the life and not give the word, or in other words, establish a Mennonite church. Others were kind of critical, you know, noting that the Methodist mission board, who MCC was seconding workers to, was finding colonization programs to be a fruitful source of converts as well. Well, you know, the MCC was not channeling their actions in this regard. MCC did, you know, in those reports, kind of push back against the missionary imperative in some cases. And we can see here by 68, MCC is meeting in Bogota, in Colombia, to sort of plan their future in Latin America. And what they say in their report is that they want to find a frontier community to develop a rounded program under MCC administration, at least initially. The objectives of the project would be to minister to the total man without a pre-decision to build or not build a Mennonite church. Now, this is kind of an interesting moment. This is February of 68. In that very month, a massive flood devastates colonization zones, represented kind of clunkily by these little dotted squares, especially to the east. The Rio Grande, this gray strip here, overflows. And Mennonites and the Methodists they work with in Montero get involved in relocating people. Initially, they house them in this Hardeman refugee camp. And then this transforms. It's supposed to just be a temporary relief, but many colonists can't go home. And Marinols working in the camp, Methodists and MCC volunteers decide to, with cooperation from the Bolivia government, resettle these displaced folks into new colonies, which you can see up here in the late 60s and early 70s, Hardeman and Pirai. And one MCC worker, writes this about it: "We are hoping that the churches that worked so well together during the refugee phase can continue working together on a colonization program to help the people build a community better than the ones they've had to leave." So this is kind of where we're moving, and MCC characterizes it almost in kind of phases. They say, phase one, operating on the outskirts of a Mennonite colony and little more. Phase two, loaning MCC workers to various missions. And phase three, a more broad range of MCC programming. And we already had Lynn in the previous session talk about the teacher abroad program, which is expanding into Bolivia as well at the time. So a lot of teachers are going out to rural communities in areas of Santa Cruz at this point. Now, this is where we have a significant shift for many organizations that are working in lowland development. And that is a major political coup. So though Bolivia had experienced a increasing authoritarian governments in the late 60s, from 64 onwards, in 1971, Hugo Banzer, with assistance from others, launches a coup and takes over for the next 7 years and rules Bolivia in ways that are similar to other authoritarian right-wing regimes across Latin America in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Not as notorious as those in Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, but certainly people are targeted from the left, disappeared, tortured. And this is kind of an interesting point to think about MCC's positioning and how it's able to negotiate this political transition. Indeed, MCC's perspective in the period before the coup that had also seen left-wing attempts to take control of the government from within the military was much more concerned about those. Dale Linsenmeyer, who gives us a lot of reporting on the political transition, talks about the pre-coup period as it's like speaking of the end of times, he says. "The day will come when we must leave Bolivia, and that day is drawing closer with each day. But when it will come, how close we are, I don't know. No MCC workers are living out of a suitcase. There are missionaries that may be." And this is a point when the Peace Corps is expelled just before the coup in the late 60s. And again, right, there's this idea that the leftists are actually ascendant, these military socialist but leftist-minded leaders. And then we have the coup itself in August of 1971. And again, there's this tension. People that Mennonites MCC had worked closely with, the Methodist Church, find themselves targeted by the coup leaders, especially, and we have an account from Jaime Bravo, who's a coordinator of Methodist, rural extension based out of Montero, working with a lot of MCCers as well. And Linsenmeyer notes this, in the wake of the coup. He says, "I never expected the right to come back strongest here in Santa Cruz. It's far more violent. The numbers killed or injured are underestimated, and the violence is not over. The military is searching homes, tracking leaders. Fortunately, no MCC workers were involved in the violence." But he does note that the Methodist Church has been hit by this moment, and particularly that Jaime Bravo, who he writes about, has had to go into hiding and then has subsequently given himself up and been imprisoned. Bravo's own account of this emphasizes the way Cold War politics changed the message of his own development activity, which, like MCC, involved extension work, agricultural work with rural communities, and forms of organizing. He says, "In that time before the coup, I was working with sugarcane workers, people that came from the interior, and he means the highlands here, suffered from injustices. Many of them had been recruited not as settlers on their own land, but as laborers by large cane growers. And they didn't have any services, hygienic, basic sanitation, fair wages. So we started to organize unions with these groups and orientation, as he describes it, so that they could demand their rights. But it was in this time when the Cold War between communists and capitalists took hold of us," and he uses the sort of metaphor like a sandwich. "And we were jailed. I was taken prisoner." Bravo was able to escape the country in the wake of the coup with the Methodist Church, arranges for his forced exile, and gets him out of jail. Others are killed in the coup. And it's a marked difference from how MCC experiences that event. So just returning back to Linsenmeyer here as well, who's reporting to Edgar Stayson in 1971, right? He says, again, fortunately, no MCC workers were involved. "It's entirely too soon to know what this new government will mean for our future here, but it should mean that the price of MCC stock in Bolivia has risen," says with an exclamation mark. And then notes in regard to the Methodist Church, "We hope for the best, but it is difficult to know what will happen. It is without a doubt their involvement in politics earlier, and especially their leaning and advocation of the leftist movements, that was the sole reason for their severe treatment by the new government. So this is the context. MCC imagines kind of an expansion of its role in the post-coup period under Banzer, and indeed, it is central to new plans for colonization and development in Santa Cruz. So at a special roundtable attended by the dictator Banzer in 1972, I believe is the date here, I'll have to check it. We see Linsenmeyer alongside other individuals. There are some representatives from the Methodist Church as well, leading a roundtable on new colonization projects in the region. And we have an interesting reflection here from Edgar Stace. A lot of the religious, faith-based development workers is usually the term I referred to here, Methodist or Mennonite, reflected on whether they wanted to continue serving in Bolivia under the coup government. And this was a discussion that kind of carries over from the last panel. And Stace writes this: our strategy is to direct our services to the little guy, but an unfortunate byproduct sometimes seems to be that this takes the pressure off the system. This leaves me uneasy, but I also hate to use the peons, he uses that term, to turn the screws down on the system. So what does one do? In most situations, I think we at MCC feel called to continue to direct our services towards a small segment to the powerless masses, hoping that in some small way we can help to reduce their misery. I can anticipate, however, lively discussion among MCC workers on this topic. And just before I continue, Jeremy, do you want to let me know how much time I have left here?
Yeah, you have about 3 minutes left.
3 minutes. Okay, that's great. It was a perfect spot. I put skip if needed. So one thing that happens in the wake of the coup, again, this colonization roundtable leads to an increased MCC participation in an interfaith orientation program. Methodists who do survive the coup period or are not exiled, mostly foreign Methodists, MCC and Maryknoll's, basically enter an agreement with Oxfam funding and the Bolivian state to support a major new colonization project at San Julian. And this becomes one of the sort of defining initiatives of the MCC over the years, the largest colonization project in Bolivian history, dozens of sort of pinwheel type formations created on newly cleared land extending to the northeast into the agricultural or colonization expansion zone. And here we kind of see in reporting on San Julian a significant change. The Bolivian government by the 1970s is very happy to turn over substantial control to this faith-based development organization, the United Church Committee, which runs the project and later converts into another NGO. It says that, our previous operations in colonization, the aims were too broad. They were outside of our reality, kind of excusing itself for lack of service provision, racist service provision, as we saw before. It really welcomes the United Church Committee under the MCC to direct this alternative model, essentially, which they work directly with colonists in these short orientation programs in which they train them how to survive in a tropical environment and frankly, how to not expect things from the state, to create local unions that will demand rights ultimately rather than looking to the state for assistance. And this colonization project ends up having one of the lowest abandonment rates of any colonization project over the years. It's sort of celebrated by international development experts that visit it. So it is kind of an interesting new approach to development, and it reflects a period of time in which, and I'll just skip ahead a few slides here, right, in which we see an increasing role of volunteer agencies. So if we look at this New York Times article from the early mid 80s, right, Mennonite organizations are mentioned here alongside a sort of a cacophony of non-governmental actors who are stepping in and taking over for an absent state or an underfunded state. And that's kind of how I see the trajectory of Mennonite Central Committee playing in Bolivia and playing quite a substantial role in some of these major new development initiatives over this period of time. The last thing I want to add in, if there's time, right, is that there could be a depoliticization involved in here. The MCC actually often present themselves as sort of a buffer between a heavy-handed state that is not capable of relating to colonists and settlers themselves who have expectations that are not met. But again, to return to Jaime Bravo, right, he mentions this as well in his reflection on working with Mennonites and working with the Methodists and working with Lutherans. He says there was no state in the colonization zones. Well, there was a state formally, but the level of the poor people and the migrant people, it wasn't there. They didn't go to the campo because they were afraid of getting bit by snakes, but we went to sleep there with the colonists. And then he talks about his own organizing within San Julian colony, which became famous for really radical settler protests to demand rights over the 80s and 90s and 2000s after the colonists had been brought in. And he says, he worked with Canadian Lutheran Relief as well as with Mennonites. He traveled to Winnipeg and met folks here and raised money. And he says they didn't know that money went to those that were blockading, protesting for their rights. If they knew, they would have cut me off. But I gave money to the blockade saying that we were in active capacitation. What is active capacitation? Blocking roads. And so there were opportunities for local actors like Jaime Bravo to sort of channel foreign support, relate to the MCC for these potentially more radical aims, even if we saw in other previous examples, MCC smoothly kind of transitioning to right-wing authoritarian governments. And I'll leave off there. I hope I didn't go too far over time.
Thank you, Ben. Our next presenter is Anna Holdorf. Anna Holdorf is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Notre Dame, where her work focuses on the intersections between the United States' religious, political, and environmental history. Her PhD dissertation, titled A Harvest for Heaven and Earth, Agricultural, Missionaries, and the Religious Roots of U.S. International Development in Latin America, examined the role of Christian missionaries and service organizations, including MCC, in the creation of U.S. rural and agricultural development programs over the 20th century. Anna's paper is titled Sowing Seeds and Saving Souls, the work of MCC in post-war Puerto Rico. Anna.
Thanks, and thanks all for being here. I will be sharing a piece of my dissertation that Jeremy just summarized there. It's a paper on an agricultural development project in Puerto Rico during and after World War II, which I imagine might be a familiar story to some people here. And this is just a small piece of the dissertation. I focus in that mostly on mainline Protestant and Catholic groups. So I'm excited to learn more from my fellow panelists here about MCC involvement in international development, as that's an aspect I'd love to expand on in a future book project. All right, so I will start with a story from Puerto Rico. As they stood atop a mountain in Bonito, Puerto Rico in the summer of 1943, Justice Holsinger and Wilbur Nachtigal took in the view with both wonder and dismay. Below, the sparkling little stream of the La Plata River and its surrounding patchwork of fields offered an escape from the violence that raged across Europe and the Asia Pacific. Far from the war front, the two men marveled at the, quote, hundreds of little houses that dotted the mountainsides and valley, inhabited by the most beautiful of God's creation, human souls. Yet the landscape seemed to them as perilous as it was picturesque. Homes perched precariously on stilts, they observed, as though even a little breeze might topple them into the ravine below. They wondered how the locals, mainly farmers by occupation, could possibly succeed in planting crops on land so steep they could barely stand upright themselves. More concerning than the position of the fields and homes, however, was the physically and morally precarious state in which their owners seemed to live. The view was very beautiful, the men concluded, and yet quite ugly in all its beauty, with the poverty, disease, and sin so common within so many of the little homes. They descended the mountain with a, quote, new determination to bring a better way of life to the people of the La Plata Valley. Holsinger and Nachtigal's gaze reflected the outlook of the US government that had sent them to Puerto Rico. As Mennonite conscientious objectors, the two young men had received exemptions from military combat in the Second World War. The US Civilian Public Service had arranged for them instead to aid the war effort through alternative service, and they worked in collaboration with the MCC to continue the work of the Puerto Rico Reconstruction Administration, which was a New Deal agency that conducted projects largely related to agricultural improvement and soil conservation on the island. It begun in 1935, the administration aimed to improve standards of living on the island by combating the effects of its long history of domination by large-scale single-crop agribusiness that had developed during Spanish colonialism and continued under US territorial control. As a result of that history, agricultural production in Puerto Rico centered around cash crops, especially coffee, tobacco, and sugar cane. While small farmers continued to grow some staple crops, large holders controlled land ownership on the islands, leaving little remaining acreage for food production. And moreover, the monocrop farming practices that the large agribusiness employed led to widespread soil depletion, which meant that most of the food that Puerto Ricans consumed had to be imported from the mainland US. So in response to these conditions, the Puerto Rico Reconstruction Administration initiated programs of land redistribution, and agricultural improvement. The agency purchased land from large corporations and then transferred plots of 5 to 10 acres to individual farmers, which they called resettlers, on a lease-to-own basis. It established several central service farms across the island where trained agronomists introduced reforestation and soil rehab programs and experimented with food crops. So this was the work that members of the MCC's Civilian Public Service Unit continued and expanded when they arrived in Puerto Rico. And it was work that they were well suited for as men who were mostly from farming communities in the Midwest and Pennsylvania, who stood eager to bring their agricultural experience to bear on their wartime effort. And then upon finding the island ripe for both agricultural and spiritual harvests in their time there, many of those men stayed on to continue the work after the war, when the MCC and the Mennonite Board of Missions and Charities purchased the property from the government to establish a joint evangelistic and service project. The MCC's La Plata project, as it became known, served as a prototype for US efforts in international development before that concept existed in its state-sanctioned Cold War form. Not until 1949 would President Harry Truman's Point 4 program make sharing scientific and technical expertise with so-called underdeveloped regions of the world an official goal of US foreign policy. But whereas the government-sponsored development programs that followed Point 4 tended to emphasize large-scale modernization and industrialization, MCC's focus on implementing small-scale agricultural improvement at the grassroots level presented an alternative vision for development. And I argue that Mennonite's work in Puerto Rico represents an early example of community development in action before that idea gained prominence among theorists and government agencies, especially in the late 1950s and 60s. The MCC's community-centered, agriculture-focused approach to development played out on the central service farm that its workers inherited from the Puerto Rico Reconstruction Administration, which was on a stretch of land that encompassed about 4,500 acres. On their own farm, which was the central service farm built by the Reconstruction Administration, Mennonites conducted outreach programs for resettlers, aiming to demonstrate by example both the dietary and economic benefits of raising specific types of crops and animals. So these were largely extension outreach services. And much of their work at first revolved around starting a dairy project, which was part of a larger effort that the government had begun to bring the Puerto Rican diet more in line with mainland standards, emphasizing protein intake especially. There were scarce sources of protein on the island, or common in Puerto Rican's diet at that time. Mennonites reported that milk and eggs and meat were more of a luxury, which resulted from a combination of factors that had arisen during the 19th century, especially the rise of cash crop monocultures that limited land for raising livestock, and then shifted breeding cattle and other livestock primarily for draft rather than for food. In partnership with Heifers for Relief, which was a recently launched program at that time, supported by the Brethren Service Committee, MCC's project in Bonito received several shipments of donated Holstein calves, which they hoped would help establish a small dairy industry on the island. And they experimented with artificial insemination on their demonstration farm, trying to improve native cattle by breeding them with those that they imported from the mainland US, which seems to have been a pretty pioneering venture at that time. One worker noted in 1945 that artificial insemination had not been tried on the island, at least not on a significant scale. But crucially, a lot of their work depended on Mennonites' ability to convince the locals of the importance of milk consumption and the benefits of keeping domesticated livestock. which were necessary foundations for any successful dairy industry that might arise. Unable to engage in religious proselytization while their project fell under the purview of the US government during wartime, Mennonite workers evangelized instead on behalf of new foodways and agricultural practices. Their appeals, often printed in the unit's Spanish language newsletter, were delivered to hundreds of resettlers in the community and stressed the opinions of agricultural experts, both in the mainland US as well as local institutions, especially the University of Puerto Rico. Pieces preached that caring for farm animals provided milk, meat, eggs, and wool that were necessary for nourishing and clothing human beings and constituted a job of value. So Mennonites in Puerto Rico often framed their work in terms of trying to teach Puerto Ricans how to be farmers, even though they were already farmers, just not by the proper farming standards of Midwestern Mennonites that they were used to on their own farms. After the war, MCC's agricultural evangelism expanded further into not only cattle, but also hogs and a growing poultry project. And it was poultry that proved most successful in taking hold among local farmers. The unit had operated a small poultry project during the war, but the MCC made it more of a priority soon after purchasing the government properties after the war, when it invested in 300 chicks with the immediate goal of producing eggs for the project's workers and a long-term vision for developing a breeding stock and industry that could, quote, assist in increasing the family income and thus raise the economic standards of the people, end quote. The poultry program produced numerous conversions. By 1954, the farm's store was selling an average of 1,500 baby chicks per month to local farmers who used them to supplement their families' diets, as well as to provide income from the sale of those they raised as broilers. The poultry and dairy industries that Mennonites helped launch in Ay Bonito flourished over the next 2 decades, even after its project there disbanded in the late 1950s. Upon returning to Puerto Rico for a visit in 1969, Justice Holsinger observed that livestock production in the region had grown significantly. The dairy industry represented one of the greatest areas of agricultural improvement by the late 60s, and poultry and egg production had proven successful also. In 1970, Ay Bonito was the largest poultry producing region in Puerto Rico, which by then Holsinger wrote with satisfaction, the old tobacco barns had been replaced by poultry barns. In 2012, one of the latest censuses I was able to access had Ay Bonito still representing the largest producer of poultry in Puerto Rico. Yet while this outcome may give the impression that the development efforts of the La Plata project were a quick and wholesale success, it's important to note that the view on the ground often looked a lot different from Mennonite's original vision for developing Ay Bonito. MCC workers faced various difficulties in implementing their plans and transforming agricultural practices on the island. As Holsinger and Noctegal had pointed out from their mountaintop view, the geography of the region differed drastically from that back home on Mennonites' Midwestern farms, which was a reality that made it impossible to merely transfer mainland agricultural models to Puerto Rico. Growing successful fruit and vegetable crops on the island, for instance, proved more problematic than they anticipated. While MCC workers assumed early on that the crops they selected would grow easily on the island with its mild tropical climate, that same climate actually allowed pests and plant diseases to flourish, and required constant watchfulness and continued spraying of the plants with chemicals to kill aphids, worms, and fungi. The steep land in the region exacerbated soil erosion and defied attempts by farmers to use modern machinery like tractors. They ended up having to resort to oxen and hoes to cultivate the land. Even establishing a dairy herd on their own demonstration farm proved difficult. The Holsteins that had been sent by heifers for relief, which were favored over other breeds due to their high volume milk production and low butterfat content, had trouble adjusting to the hilly landscape. Several ended up stumbling, breaking their backs or legs, and having to be butchered. So in addition to all of those difficulties, Mennonites' work also produced some unintended environmental consequences in their wake. In order to replace Puerto Ricans' largely plant-based diet with one that favored animal protein, members of the La Plata Project found themselves somewhat ironically preoccupied with cultivating new varieties of vegetation to nourish the livestock that would become food themselves. Mennonites' efforts to raise dairy cattle, for example, led them to experiment with new types of grasses and other plants to sustain future herds. Eventually, they settled on kudzu, a legume that produced more and better quality feed than any other grasses that they tried. A vine native to Asia, kudzu was first imported to North America in the late 19th century and was widely promoted by the USDA as a solution to soil erosion in the South. It was a great ground cover and choked weeds. First introduced to Puerto Rico in 1940, where federal experiment stations conducted trials to assess its worth as an erosion control method in forage crop there. Mennonite agriculturists at La Plata participated in the spread of kudzu on the island by sowing it on hillsides for pasturage and harvesting seed that they then sold to local farmers to encourage its planting. Of course, those experiments with kudzu, as we know now, took a slightly different turn than their designers envisioned. It would only take a decade for agricultural scientists to realize that the miracle vine they'd promoted during the 40s posed a serious ecological problem as it grew uncontrollably and led to costly eradication efforts. Environmental issues accompanied the growth of Puerto Rico's poultry industry as well, namely water pollution caused by runoff from manure-laden soils on chicken farms. Studies of the island's poultry zone, which includes Ibonito, scientists from the University of Puerto Rico conducted during the 1990s, revealed a widespread threat to water quality caused by excessive phosphorus levels that came from the farms. When it came to evangelism, though, Protestantism did not take hold in Puerto Rico as easily as poultry or kudzu. After the war, the MCC added evangelistic work to its program, constructing a chapel for Mennonite workers and locals alike, and implementing a community religious program. It included weekly church services, Bible studies, Bible schools, and home visitations that they were now able to conduct after their relationship with the US government was severed. Yet when Justice Holsinger returned to the island in 1969, Protestants remained religious minorities in Puerto Rico at large, and including in the La Plata Valley, where 88% of the people still identified themselves as Catholics. Of the region's 12% Protestant population, Holsinger found that the majority claimed membership in La Plata's Mennonite Church, and he took comfort in noting that the vast majority of the people he surveyed in the region believed that Mennonites had made a positive contribution in the community, even if they had not become converts themselves. The MCC's La Plata project then leaves a complicated legacy. Agricultural conversions seemed more numerous than spiritual ones, but even where new industries emerged to bring greater economic and food security, like Ibonito's poultry industry, new ecological issues sometimes accompanied them. The community development model did not altogether avoid the problems that large-scale modernization and industrialization-focused development models received criticism for. But still, as competing visions of modernization versus community development came to a head during the Cold War era, former Mennonite missionaries and the MCC would continue to advocate for the model they pursued in Puerto Rico. A community development approach is really what distinguished religious development projects like the MCC's from state-sponsored ones initially. And state-sponsored development programs actually gradually ended up adopting religious models as they themselves became stronger proponents of community development in later decades. This dynamic is especially evident in the work of International Voluntary Services, or IVS, which was officially a secular organization, but created by former representatives from the MCC, the Brethren Service Committee, and the American Friends Service Committee in 1953. IVS targeted its efforts at projects operating at village level. So it was a community development organization at its core. And its members lobbied their connections in US government on behalf of community development for nearly a decade after its founding. And the effort came to fruition in the formation of the Peace Corps, which historians have pointed out drew directly from the example of IVS and its predecessors in the mission field. So I'll stop there, but I'm looking forward to hearing more about MCC's involvement in development from Jeremy and in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anna. Our next presenter is Jeremy Rich. Let me just pull up my remarks. Jeremy Rich is professor of history at Marywood University in Scranton, Pennsylvania. He is a specialist in Congolese and Gabonese history. His most recent book, Protestant Missionaries and Humanitarianism in the DRC, The Politics of Aid in Cold War Africa, examines how MCC and Mennonite missionaries helped provide famine relief and medical volunteers in the Congo in the 1960s. He is currently researching material for a book on MCC's work in the Congo from 1960 to the 1990s. Jeremy's paper is titled The Gospel of Chicken and Rabbits, Mennonite Volunteers in Agricultural Development in the Congo, 1960 to 1975.
Thank you so much, and to all the organizers and those of you who are participants and attendees for putting together this exciting conference. And I come to you from Scranton, Pennsylvania. I teach at Marywood University, and I want to acknowledge that this was part of the ancestral homeland of the Lenni Lenape, otherwise known as the Delaware Native American community. And this is going to be part of a book project I've been slowly working on for several years, looking at the Mennonite Central Committee's work in the Democratic Republic of Congo from the independence of the Congo in 1960, going until basically the early 1990s. And so I'll just go ahead. This presentation is going to be focused on two particular questions. How did North American Mennonite missionaries and organizations conceptualize the aims and methods of development in the Democratic Republic of Congo from 1960 till 1980? And how did Congolese and North American Mennonite stakeholders negotiate their different understandings of what development was in this time period leading up until the early 1980s? This presentation examines these questions through the evolution of one particular agricultural project, le Service du Développement Agricole, or SEDA as I will refer to it, an agricultural program that was founded by an Africa Inter-Mennonite missionary. I'm going to refer to that organization as AIMM. The missionary's name was Fremont Regier, that he formed this organization in 1965, this program in 1965 in Nyanga, which is located in a rural region in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The ideals of SEDA particularly focused on a community development ethos that centered on a small-scale altruistic Christian fellowship and North American technical expertise, which eventually collided against both the inequalities that underpinned the economic policies of the Congolese state under the dictatorship of Mobutu Sese Seko, and shifting Congolese understandings of the proper goals and methods of development. Regier tried to convince rural farmers as well as church leaders to embrace the gospel of chickens and rabbits, unquote, as Mennonite Brethren agricultural volunteer and future university president, Merrill Ewert described SEDA's goal of using North American techniques to raise animals and poultry. However, SEDA's organization and activities fluctuated a great deal between two different models, between household production and in a goal to basically increase protein available for individual families in rural areas, and a rival model promoting basically large-scale poultry production to raise money for cash-strapped Congolese Mennonite churches. And this posed a challenge for Mennonite Central Committee volunteers. Were they in the Congo to help convince individual families to adopt techniques taken from their own farming backgrounds in North America? Or were they there to help churches raise money by using more large-scale hatcheries and other forms of more large-scale poultry production? Rather than having a firm answer to these kinds of questions, North American Mennonite staff and their Congolese collaborators tried to encourage small and large-scale production simultaneously. What began as Reguier's idealistic vision of Congolese farmers embracing North American methods turned to a much more complex story in which Congolese church leaders pushed to rapidly expand SEDA's reach and to further their own dreams of development. Even as Congolese more tightly grasped North American financial and technical support from MCC and AIMM in the worsening conditions of the economic conditions of the 1970s, North American Mennonite volunteers, MCC volunteers, at times resented what they deemed as the overly profit-driven mission of SEDA. And I want to place this study and the larger book project in kind of two intersection frames of development in terms of our historical understanding of this period. One I would consider to be the national frame. This is the kind of approach that is much more common among historians looking at questions of development in Congo, placing development programs in the context of Cold War development and nation building. That the Congo had been a major battleground in the early 1960s in terms of rival Soviet and US influence, and the US was the winner, and a tremendous amount of international support from Western countries, especially the United States, went into the Congo, particularly after Mobutu Sese Seko seized power in the fall of 1965 and remained the dictator of the country until his overthrow in the mid-1990s. So there's been a great deal of work that's been done looking at how Western development programs were specifically designed to prop up Mobutu's regime as an anti-communist ally. And there's also been a great deal that's been done in terms of looking at how Mobutu and his corrupt regime cashed in on a lot of this foreign aid, and many sort of white elephants, failed very expensive development programs, such as dams, such as a failed rocket program in the late 1970s, and so on. Compared to this, there's another frame that I tried to address, which is looking at developments in terms of MCC as an organization, an institutional frame. That the 1960s and 1970s proved to be a challenging time as MCC personnel, whether they're volunteers in the field or working in Akron, are dealing with the challenges of the civil rights movement, decolonization, and trying to address new challenges in terms of development and moving away from a focus so much on Mennonite communities themselves. And this also is going to involve changes from the Vietnam era with the rising numbers of youth volunteers through the PAX program, and after the end of the Vietnam War, with a decline in MCC volunteers and the end of the draft. So I suggest that in both these approaches have their own kind of blind spots. Certainly very little work has been done in the Congo regarding church-based development programs, whether Mennonite or others, in the 1960s and 1970s. That there's been much more focus on programs funded by the World Bank, and particularly the US government and the Belgian government. In terms of studies primarily by former MCC staff regarding the impact and development of MCC-supported programs in the Congo, there tends to be much less said about the larger political context, as well as how MCCs were compared to numerous other development programs taking place in the same time. So my work is trying to connect these two strains of thought. I'll now turn to SEDA itself. SEDA originally was known when it was put together by Fremont Reguier in 1965, not by the term SEDA, but actually by an English title, the Congo Mennonite Agricultural Service, or COMAS. That although the Congo's official language was French, it was not much of a surprise that an Anglophone Mennonite community would basically name an agricultural project in English. And that Reguier really represented the close ties between AIMM and MCC, AIM being at this point the Congo Inland Mission. Fremont Reguier, pictured on the left, was a PAX volunteer in the late 1950s, shortly before Congolese independence. After he completed his time as a PAX volunteer, he eventually decided to become a agricultural missionary of AIMM. And by all accounts, in MCC records and in interviews with dozens of people who had worked with him in various capacities, Reguer was seen as a real model manager, someone who was fluent in Gipende, a Congolese language, someone who did not present himself in a paternalist way towards dealing with Africans, someone who had a tremendous sense of faith that really inspired a lot of PAX volunteers around him, and somebody who was really willing to listen and make changes based on sort of evaluation of the effectiveness of agricultural programs, but also the concerns of others, whether they were Congolese or North American stakeholders. At the same time, it's important to recognize in the 1960s that Reguer and his supporters, whether in Akron or in Elkhart, basically between AIMM and the MCC, looked at agricultural development in a particular way, one in which that highlighted political innocence, that did not, and by using this term, basically distancing themselves from any direct connection from the US foreign policy in the Congo, and really also trying to distance themselves from the legacy of Belgian colonial rule and authoritarian efforts to promote agricultural development. It's also an approach that highlighted technical solutions. I'm noticing them spell in my PowerPoint. That really highlighted the supposed superiority of North American techniques in terms of raising poultry and rabbits and other small animals. And this assumption that this kind of technical superiority kind of went along with a certain kind of paternalism as well, an assumption that these programs would automatically be for the benefit of Congolese. It was just a matter of convincing Congolese of their value. That this is not a time period in SEDA or in most agricultural programs in the Congo, realistically, where Congolese concerns were really seriously considered. Instead, the idea was the wisdom is coming from Europe and North America. It's just a matter of the Congolese adjusting and putting these ideas and techniques into practice. This program, in its first 10 years, goes through two eras that I would basically dub one the PAX Boys era of the late 1960s and early 1970s, and then what I would call the production era. These are gross simplifications, but they do indicate, I think, an authentic understanding of some of the major changes in SEDA as it operated. The PAX Boys era basically refers to the fact that from the time that Fremont Reguer started to run the program in 1965, he relied heavily on PAX volunteers in on 2 to 2.5 year terms. Some of them would work on a demonstration farm that he set up early on. However, as far as Reguer was concerned, one of the biggest successes of this era came from an idea brought to him by two PAX volunteers themselves, Dean Linsenmeyer and Roger Busenitz. In late 1966, health reasons forced Reguer to take a furlough for several months in the United States with his family. This left several PAX volunteers, namely Linsenmeyer and Busenitz, in charge of this agricultural program with relatively limited command of Gipende, the local, or Kituba, the main languages spoken in the area. What Busenitz and Linsenmeyer decided to do was to expand extension routes. At first, they would drive trucks through villages, stop and try to introduce villagers to these new techniques, to them at any rate, in terms of how to build chicken coops and how to raise rabbits in particular, with several Congolese partners from the demonstration farm. Eventually, they switched from cars to bikes. It was a much slower path to obviously move from one village to another, but this gave them more time to talk with local communities. And at least from the standpoint of both interviews of over 15 people who were MCC PAX volunteers with SEDA during this time period, as well as in written correspondence, this approach had a lot of support from rural Congolese communities, that the PAX volunteers remembered being welcomed into communities, that some Congolese would actually say to these PAX volunteers, "You're not like the missionaries, as one former PAX volunteer put it in an interview in 2016. You PAX people are not like the missionaries because you come to stay and you listen to us. Even though this seems to have been a big success in terms of reception, it did not, on the other hand, relatively few people seem to have started to raise poultry and especially rabbits in large numbers. So although the idea of these visits was were quite popular, it is hard to tell how much these volunteers actually convince people to take up these kinds of techniques. This period comes to an end in 1971 and 1972, where we basically have a new series of factors taking root. One is going to be the decline of the PAX program with the end of the Vietnam War and declining numbers of volunteers. There's also going to be concerns from some PAX volunteers that they felt like they were doing work that Congolese could do if they were properly trained to do it, instead of relying on North American volunteers to do it. At the same time, Fremont Regier successfully obtained a very large grant from Oxfam, a well-known UK development organization, of over 300, what would now in 2021 US dollars be over $350,000 to greatly expand poultry production. Oxfam staff considered this to be far more effective than relying on PAX volunteers basically traveling from village to village, because the idea was you could produce far more protein for communities that were suffering from malnutrition. Another change is going to come from a more assertive Congolese stakeholder, namely the CMZ, that stands for Communauté Mennonite du Zaire, basically the Congolese Mennonite church that had become independent of AIMM. CMZ church leaders wanted to basically greatly expand the SETA program outside of Nyanga to basically every major church center, most of them being former mission centers under missionary control under colonial rule. So in other words, Congolese stakeholders wanted to see SETA expand dramatically, just as a time where Oxfam's money would allow that to happen. Regier found himself in the middle of these kinds of pressures, as did his colleagues, such as Ray Brubaker, who served as MCC country director in the early 1970s, followed by becoming Africa department director. He's actually one of the participants or one of the attendees today. And that Regier tried to negotiate between the demands of Congolese church leaders with what he saw as the more successful kinds of extension programs, which was a much more challenging period for him as a result between 1972 and 1975. But perhaps the most central issue, and this is what I will be finishing with in terms of looking at challenges that SETA was facing, has to do with a central question: who was going to actually be in charge of SETA in the 1970s? Fremont Regier served as the head of SETA between 1965 and 1975. But by the early 1970s, the unquestioned authority of Regier was increasingly facing a series of challenges. One had to do with Mobutu Sese Seko's growing proposition of what he called authenticity, the need for Africans and Congolese in particular to supposedly take control of their destinies and abandon the legacy of colonialism. Basically, what this meant was, in practice, that some officials started to pressure SETA by arguing that, in fact, perhaps SETA should be nationalized and taken over by the state, or at the very least, there should be a Congolese in charge of the organization. This fit at the same time where there's more and more demands that Mennonite Congolese pastors had to basically control the resources of SETA coming in from North America. In other words, if this was said to be a Congolese development program, should it not be Congolese churches that are actually in charge of setting the agenda of how we'll operate? At MCC headquarters in Akron, there was increasing concern as well that Regier, as competent as he was and as popular he was, represented what was known as the white biggies. In other words, not allowing Congolese to basically take up leadership positions. And so the combination of these factors led Regier to basically seek out a replacement. And he found that in a man named Bernard Ngulubi Mazemba, who he nominated in 1973 with the approval of Congolese pastors in AIMM and MCC to become his assistant director. Ngulubi was the son of a prominent Mennonite pastor from Nyanga, where Seda had started out. And over the next 2 years, between 1973 and 1975, Ngulubi and Regier became caught in a difficult struggle for power within the CMC church, particularly between Nyanga, the town where Ngulubi came from and where Seda had started out, with Chikapa, a much larger city located 65 kilometers to the south, which happened to be the headquarters of the CMC. Basically, pastors from Chikapa felt that Ngulubi becoming director would continue to favor Nyanga over their interests. And so there's actually delays in Ngulubi actually taking over the organization as a result, largely not so much from the MCC end or AIM end, in other words, from the North Americans, but rather because of these tensions in the CMC and the concerns that Chikapa leaders had about Ngulubi's fitness and whether or not he would favor Nyanga over their region. Be that as may, Regier finally convinced his Congolese colleagues to accept Ngulubi as director in 1975. Unfortunately for Ngulubi, 1975 was not the greatest year to become the head of an agricultural program in Congo. Mobutu's kleptocratic policies and major corruption had led to a great deal of disruption in the Congolese economy, and the worldwide recession that started to hit in 1973 really devastated the Congolese economy as well. So you have rapidly growing inflation, you have a very disrupted economy, and Ngulubi is now in charge of Seda, dealing with this economic chaos. Ngulubi is accused of being incompetent as a manager by Congolese and also by MCC volunteers and by some AIM missionaries. Eventually, he's also accused of not just incompetence and administrative mismanagement, but also accused at times of embezzling money. In the larger paper that this is based on, I argued to some degree that the kind of criticism Ngulubi received had to do with the transition from having a North American white director to a Congolese Black director, and that one could certainly have suggested that Regier himself may have made some missteps, but was not nearly questioned and criticized in the same way as Ngulubi. So I can get into that in the Q&A if people are interested. It's a I'm summarizing a very complicated debate in the mid-70s. Eventually, the CMC, particularly its Chikapa faction and AM missionaries, basically agreed together to force Ngulubi to step down and basically select a MCC volunteer named George, rather an AIM missionary named Arnold Harder to take over the organization in 1978. And that this was viewed on the one hand by some in MCC as a step back in terms of having a North American director come in again. However, the criticism of Ngulubi had reached such a point that it seemed untenable that he would be able to continue to run the organization. Seda would continue to be run by North Americans all the way through the early 1990s. So in this presentation, and I'll stop here for time, I would say that you can get a sense of some of the challenges in terms of the ideals that North Americans had in the 60s and 70s about how this program would operate, as opposed to the kind of political realities and the divided Congolese stakeholders themselves. And also, particularly what we've heard earlier today in terms of debates about a need to listen to stakeholders not from North America. While that's certainly a valid, vital need, but it's a very, as I think we all know, that's also a very complicated thing to do, especially when you're not dealing with a united community of stakeholders. In other words, there are a great deal of divisions within the Congolese church that had a significant impact in terms of Seda that did not necessarily lead it to always positive directions, or at least avoid conflict among Congolese themselves about the nature of development. And so with that, I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeremy. And thank you, Ben and Anna, as well, for your stimulating papers. We now have about 20 minutes for questions and discussion. Seeing no questions in the Q&A window yet, and please do feel free to drop one in there. Perhaps I'll get us started with a question for all three panelists. The title of this session is Agriculture and Religion in Global Context. How were MCC's understanding of Christianity and its conception of religious mission reflected in its approaches to agricultural development? We've mentioned the focus on small farm agriculture, early community development, and so on. And also, how does this connection between the understanding of Christianity and development change over time? Ben.
I can jump in, Jeremy, unless anyone wants to go first. This is what I jumped rapidly over in my presentation. So certainly, yeah, I think there was throughout MCC's time in the 60s and 70s in Bolivia, consistent discussion of whether it was sort of achieving religious or secular aims, and something that was reflected on by a lot of the individuals that served in Bolivia over that time period. One form for doing that, it popped up in various ways. MCCers, of course, submitted these kind of 3-month reports, to the MCC Bolivia office that was then circulated back to Akron. They also published a small newsletter called The Grindstone. And I just read very briefly a quote from Murray Luft, who had an article in there for a period of time called The Slaughterhouse. And he determined, and he also wrote a pamphlet before that, kind of emphasizing people's distilling the anthropological perspective of Robert Redfield on village life and encouraging MCCers to be sort of amateur anthropologists in their village communities. But writing to MCC Bolivia volunteers, he said, he'd promised not to bring my Christian theology to bear on Bolivians. I say this for 2 reasons. I do not feel personally comfortable in an evangelizing role, whether here or at home in Canada. I have too many unanswered questions about the culturally specific implications and consequences of evangelizing in rural Bolivia. Hence, I challenge the simple assumption that if I am a Christian, my only job is to communicate the gospel verbally and bring about an individual conversion experience in the heart of a Bolivian peasant. So Murray kind of reflected on this a lot, but I see other 3-month reports from people working in Bolivia that pretty seamlessly mixed sort of religious participation and outreach to surrounding rural communities with their agricultural work. So they were selling Bibles and seeds at the local agricultural fairs, or they were reaching out to other religious organizations in the region as well. So there was certainly a spectrum of responses there.
Thanks, Ben. Anna and Jeremy, would either of you care to comment?
Just briefly, the workers that I am familiar with, I know emphasized a concept of mission that integrated both faith and service, faith and works. There was no sort of tension between that for them, like I think there are in other denominations, especially evangelical Protestants I've looked at. That sort of integrated faith and service model is what MCC workers in Puerto Rico were building on. I have not followed them into the future long enough to know if that changed among those particular workers I look at here in the 40s and 50s. But perhaps Jeremy, who's working in later period, might have some more insight there.
I mean, I would say that by the 1960s and 70s in Congo, there is this tension that is playing out, that MCC volunteers as a whole, I would say, and staff too, like Ray Brubaker, who again is an attendee here, among others, wanted to distance themselves from being tied to what they saw as the kind of the overly racist and certainly paternalist aspects of mission operations, and also wanted to expand well beyond working with just Mennonites. I mean, they had lots and lots of volunteers coming in, so there's a practical reason at the height of the Vietnam War to find placements. But there is this idea that that is frequent in terms of interviews with PAX volunteers and activity reports that PAX volunteers and TAPPers, that Teachers Abroad program volunteers, would write, saying that we're not missionaries. We are not here to be missionaries. We're providing Christian service, perhaps, but we're not with them. In other words, we're not with the Mennonite Brethren mission. We're not with AIMM. We're certainly not with some of these other evangelical and seen as much more conservative missions. So that's a really big tension in the late 60s and early 70s. But that changes. By the 1980s, that tension between faith and work seems to have largely vanished, where where volunteers in their writings and in interviews, they basically see them going as hand in hand again. So you basically have a period where faith and work seem to be more separated, particularly in the late 60s and early 70s. And then by the early 80s, they're kind of coming back together. So.
Thank you. Jeremy, another question for you. This is from Ruth Kydell Clemens. Ruth writes, my understanding is that the Seda Nyanga project significantly increased food security / access to a wide community around Nyanga and beyond, even to this day, in spite of all the challenges of the project. Is this your understanding as well from your research?
Well, one of the huge, and keep in mind, I'm not an MCC person. Don't hold it against me. I'm not even a Mennonite or an Anabaptist, so I'm in a minority here, but I'm in the world majority, I guess. So that makes me feel better. But in any event, I haven't been to Nyanga. I haven't done field work in Congo yet. I'm really hoping to do that either next summer or more likely in 2 summers. One of the things that's really, really tricky with looking a lot of the material from the 1960s and 70s, as opposed to much, I'd say from the 90s onward, is how you determine what success looks like. Like, in other words, what kind of data are you using? In the 60s and 70s, it's really anecdotal. Like, this looks good, but there isn't like any statistics or anything like that to work with. It's certainly my impression that in Nyanga, Seda worked very well and was quite effective in terms of increasing like efficiency and productivity. But then to define that in terms of evidence, other than people saying it was working, is really tricky. That probably speaks a little bit to MCC as a whole, as opposed to taking this more standardized quantitative model of determining success that you see in development generally in the 1990s. But certainly that's my impression so far. And I really want to go to Nyanga itself and the surrounding region to kind of get a sense, at least in a limited way, of how people remember, Congolese people remember the program today.
Thank you, Jeremy. I have another question for all 3 panelists. This comes from Royden Lowen. Royden asks, to what extent did the predominantly agricultural background of Mennonites in North America and Europe contribute to these rural programs?
I mean, I guess I'll go in reverse order, I guess, from the panel, I'd say it was pretty significant. I mean, there was an assumption in the 1960s, certainly in a lot of the MCC correspondence that I've looked at, that somehow an 18-year-old or 19-year-old coming from a farm in Manitoba or Nebraska somehow had this tremendous amount to share with Congolese, even though farming in Congo is a little bit different than farming in the American Midwest or in the Canadian prairies. And I think it's part of this larger ideal, this Mennonite rural ideal that the MCC staff, I think, were very attracted to. And certainly in terms of raising chicken and rabbits, a lot of the volunteers had experience with that. But whether or not it really fit with Congolese realities so much and Congolese farming techniques as they were is kind of another story, which might help explain why there seems to have been some run-ins from Congolese village communities from like taking on these kinds of techniques, I guess.
And if we're going in reverse order, I can jump in. I mean, I would say it affected this particular project a lot. Mennonite farmers who come from the United States, were particularly, I think, excited about participating in this particular type of alternative service since they had that background and that experience. But more than that, I think Mennonite's agricultural background influenced the approach they took to their work in Puerto Rico. Like I said, they were teaching farmers already. Like the Puerto Ricans they worked with were farmers by occupation, but not necessarily the types of farmers that Mennonites coming from the mainland US were hoping to cultivate. They were farming, cash crops, tobacco, especially crops that Mennonites were opposed to, tobacco, right, and sugar cane that went to make rum. And so there was some moral opposition to the types of crops they were growing, as well as just the model of a cash crop agribusiness. And so their sort of small scale farming of subsistence crops would have influenced, I think, their approach on the ground.
Yeah, I'll chime in there as well. And so I think certainly the agricultural backgrounds of a lot of these volunteers played in, although in a bit of a strange way, because really, I mean, their own families had been often sort of mechanized out of the agricultural economy or had seen significant transformations in the family farm, which might have had any sort of resemblance to what they were trying to create in Bolivia with small farmers, without mechanization primarily. But that seemed to almost add a greater enthusiasm, whether their expertise was sufficient, enthusiasm for things like pushing forward animal traction programs, and appropriate technology by the time we get into the 70s. So I don't know if they looked back and idealized things that they felt like had been missing in the North American context. I know talking to some Methodists, they certainly spoke about it in that way, that their parents and grandparents had been, circuit preachers and small farmers. But that would be an interesting aspect to it. Just to add on, right? Certainly agronomy is a big focus, but a lot of these individuals end up, if they come back and forth to Bolivia, moving into sociology, like planning programs at places like Cornell. And so they use alternative tools as well, right? Not just the specifically agricultural ones, especially as they kind of see their job as, involving almost social psychology of working with colonists who are new to an area and building community.
Thanks, Ben. We have a question from Ray Brubaker. Ray writes, "Thanks, Jeremy Rich. You brought back many memories. In 1971, during a visit by my supervisor from Akron, I took him to visit Bishop Okeliali, president of the Christian Council of Congo. My supervisor asked him what is the major contribution of MCC in Congo. His response, 'You guys are willing to jump in the trenches and dig dirt with the Congolese. That means a lot to us.' Amazing responses given the high level of professionals we had in MCC. How does that fit into your research? Sorry if that sounds like a trite question."
I mean, I think one of the things that's really striking about the late 60s and early 70s, as opposed to the mid 70s, even though it's a short span of difference, is that certainly people like Bokeleale, who was basically one of the most powerful Protestants, if not the most powerful Protestant leader in the entire country by 1970, had a very positive view of MCC, in large part because they distanced themselves from many North American missionaries who had a real difficulty accepting Congolese leadership taking over a lot of mission-founded churches. And MCCers were generally not trying to order Congolese around. MCCers had not been in the Congo as missionaries before 1960, before independence, where sort of white dominance was just assumed in the vast majority of Congolese Protestant churches, And I think on the ground, there's certainly, at least from the perceptions from the MCC volunteers that you read, like over 100 who work in Congo, there was a lot of esteem for the kind of work that they did among ordinary people. I would say that, as you know from your experiences as Africa director and as country director in over the course of the 70s, I'm really curious to see what Congolese Mennonite church leaders, how many of them are still around, there aren't that many who are prominent in this period in the 1970s, might have thought of things, given that they were really some of the key figures in the competition for resources from MCC and from AIMM and from the Mennonite Brethren Mission Board, right? So I have run across a fair amount of like tensions in some of the letters in the 70s and early 80s, not so much from ordinary Congolese whose voices are really not very vocal much of the time. It's hard to pull them out from available sources directly, but certainly from Congolese Mennonite church leaders, the kind of people who saw themselves as the ones who wanted to really control how programs like SETA operated, where I don't know if they necessarily appreciated the willingness of MCCers to get into the trenches, although I think they did, but also there was a lot of tensions between them and MCC at times over how these programs are going to be directed, and especially was MCC going to continue to give money? Like, in other words, the question of dependence that Congolese Mennonite church leaders, they wanted to stay dependent because the financial situation for their churches was really going downhill. So I think there is certainly a lot of appreciation that come across in terms of the willingness of MCCers to do difficult jobs and to work alongside rather than managing or around Congolese. But there's also other kinds of tensions about that issue of dependence as well.
Thanks, Jeremy. Given that we have just 4 minutes left, I'm going to have to be selective with the questions here. Phil Fountain says, to what extent did MCC lead or follow broader trends in the agricultural development world? Were they innovators or followers? I'm particularly interested in whether you saw connections or disconnections between each other's histories and country contexts. And I think I'll put that question to Anna or Ben if they would like to answer that first. If not, we do have other questions we could respond to.
I can go, but I'd like to give Anna an opportunity if you prefer.
I mean, so that first question about innovators versus followers, I would want to say that they were innovators in the sense that Mennonite agriculturists and religious agricultural missionaries in general that I've found sort of pioneered this grassroots community development approach, and then maintained it even as the trend in the agricultural development world went more toward like large scale development and industrial agriculture. So I guess innovators in that sense, but sort of early, like the earliest innovators, if that makes sense. Ben, you're welcome to take over.
Thanks. Yeah, I think in the Bolivian context for the San Julian colonization project, it was celebrated in the 70s and 80s, early 80s as one of the only successful tropical colonization or new land settlement programs by a number of organizations like the Institute for Development Anthropology as like a model sort of, and it was a success. And Jeremy brought up the question of success because people didn't abandon the colony. Like, so MCC had used local sort of orientators to teach people how to survive and not leave. And that was kind of how it was seen as a small scale success. But that changed because, again, ag in Bolivia was moving towards large scale soybean production as well. And so more tangible economic gains were not as forthcoming. And then a new wave of interpretation, really kind of an environmental lens, would also see this maybe not as a success, but as part of an ecological disaster, which is actually how some subsequent MCCers that I talked to had framed it, right? This involves large scale land clearing too. So a challenging question there.
And I guess you could say that in the 60s, and I think MCC could, and certainly somebody like Fremont Regier could be seen as really exceptional. This is a period where there's a lot of technical aid coming in from France, especially from Belgium, the US, and Canada as well. There's numerous players, but a lot of them tend to have a more technical idea of bringing in equipment, which is not something Regier wanted to do in terms of small scale work. However, even SETA ends up taking this more large-scale approach, dependent on foreign technology and money in the early 1970s. That's sort of the heyday of this. And some people at the time in the early 70s argued, you know, like having these PAX volunteers run around, that just doesn't produce very much. However, on the flip side, it also doesn't cost very much, which becomes an increasing issue from the mid 70s onward, where there's less and less money coming in from outside, and there's more of a concerns about sustainability, which meant that to some degree, you could argue the Regeers kind of model was a lot more cost effective and sustainable than this more technical heavy and capital heavy approach that was popular in the early 70s.
Well, here in the Central Time Zone, it's 3 p.m. So I'm afraid it's time for us to wrap this session up. I do see that there are still 2 questions, maybe even 3 remaining. One from Meredith Finch, 2 remaining. One from Meredith Finch and one from Alan Harder. Perhaps Jeremy would like to respond to Alan Harder's question in writing, because it looks like a good one. Thank you again to all the panelists, and thank you participants for your thoughtful questions. We will now have a short break, but do stick around. I expect several of the themes that we have discussed here will come up again in our next panel, starting in half an hour, titled MCC and Transnational Flows of Agricultural Knowledge.